Well, yes, but then there's this memory function, right? The old guy first, it's a strain to go back to yesterday.
Computers do most of the memorization.
Well, if you can read them. Okay, so that's my last slide. Deliberation, care, right. Okay. All right. The theory is, the way we're working this bit of business, Marty's driving. We've got the slides. This is a GoPro. This will be recording us, if that's all right with you. We want to utilize stuff to help. Then we'll be, so Marty will be here. We'll be hanging here in the center. We're going to talk. For our talk, we'll be sitting right here and walk up. Okay. 2 parts. We're sitting there giving our talks one at a time. Then, second half, we're all up here having throw kickback things. So enjoy what we do. Something like that. Okay. So that's the theory.
Ty już działasz jeszcze? No to fajnie, byłem w kamerze i wytykałem język.
Ale nie ma na razie, jest tylko szła.
I do not.
let's hope that they
Ja, je kan haar ontsnappen met iets.
Nee, dat technology and power. Well, it's going on software.
You're in the yes. We'll park down here with easy access up to there.
Wel, dat is in elk geval de theorie. Dat is een gebrek aan theorieën en
Ja.
En dat is wel leuk. Ja, dat weet ik ook niet. Dat is wel nieuw. Het is
Well, not because I went through a peer reviews
First 3 rows, just interrupt. If the 5 heads are written like this, it's okay. If I go like this, or like this, or you lean to look at something, any movement is expected. Can't take
there?
visual movement, then you
Oh yeah, here.
that's
Oh boy, but it's on a different scale.
Are we starting 4 minutes?
It's not a rating. You don't get someone who stands up and yells at you for 10 minutes. Basically, they all ganged up on me, and I was staying there, and I was right by myself, and they were like, okay, you sure people in the room about it? And they were just there, and
I didn't do that. I didn't break that cup of coffee.
oh
No, I heard somebody's coffee.
no. There, yeah.
Right. You're able to, that's got a mic, so we don't need to talk into a microphone, that'll pick us up.
I mean, I hope that will work fine, because I'm not sure about this system, and I cannot plug into the mixer.
Okay, that's all right. You're using your stuff, and your
Yes.
intention is that it's this.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Did you spill the damn cup of coffee? Are you the one? Someone else spilled a cup of coffee?
You want me to tell people?
My cup of coffee is sitting there.
What's the whistleblower policy out there?
Hmm?
What's the whistleblower policy you got?
It's more complicated than that, particularly for female researchers. I mean, you read any, there's a whole bunch of literature about, particularly about women in philosophy, about how this is actually really, it's much more complicated than just coming back with baby lines. There's a lot of power structures that are really complicated. And
We're set up.
We're set up.
I don't know who's
what's this do? I don't know about this. So we went to the women in, I can send you a bunch of papers.
I didn't even see it. You want to sit here?
Your name is like my name. That's because it has a front and back.
Of course.
Correct.
She did very
Thank you. Yeah, I decided not to focus too much on the paper because I enjoyed the
I do that in 4 days.
Yeah. And basically, it comes down to monitor the data,
This discussion we're having right now, it's so valuable, right? You invite my idea, you practice what happens in these situations, this is not the situation where the situation we're talking about. You're a senior professor, and I'm a junior professor. I'm trying to stand up for my ideas, and you're just throwing stuff. You obviously haven't done this.
Smart flags on.
That's very, very proposition, right? It's not like for a curriculum. How do you stand up to someone just throwing something? It's power.
Oh, wow. 10 years.
Yeah, it's supervised but there's an obligation. There's an obligation for Sure, and this is the type of time that also happens to have a detrimental effect on the person.
Oh, they're filming this as well. I don't think they've got a wide
I'm sorry, I think that's the rest of the time we're talking about. You're already reading, yeah, right there, a whole bunch of things that happen before
Are you going on tour? I have no idea, but I've heard that yeah, you should check it out.
You're going to sleep up there?
Microphone. Come on. Are you going in there? Yeah.
Like anywhere, because I feel red flags. Because now I have to go to
Right, yeah. Okay, we want to be sure that you've all brought your homework with you. Homework is contained in a beautiful blue booklet like this, and on the third page at the top is a wonderful picture of a handsome person.
And then dog.
Thank you for coming to this event. This discussion on the ACM code is, in one sense, a celebration and a thank you. The ACM Code of Ethics was passed on June 22nd, along with some enforcement procedures and some policies having to do with behavior at conferences by the ACM Council by a unanimous vote. The Code of Ethics, which you'll hear about, was worked on in an incredibly transparent nature, multiple drafts, out to the community, multiple comments, internet facilities, using the technology, and input from all of you and the Ethicomp community. So what we're trying to do is say, here's one shot at a code of ethics that we came up with, and we're going to try and share back some of the information that we learned. So that's why we're here. But the most important word is thank you. Really amazing. Okay, that's why we're here. And who are we? I can see, there's the slides, that's who we are. Hi, I'm John Godwin. I had the incredible luck to chair this committee that put all this together. And you stopped on. The amount of interest was incredible. And yes, we had some really wonderful folks working for us and with us, and a few of us are here. Kathryn Flick is a member of the Committee on Professional Ethics. She works for CC. Am I in the way?
No, I actually.
Wait a minute, let me inhale so you have room. Okay. All right, Kathryn Flick, our technical cinematic coordinator. Michael Kirkpatrick authored some of the wonderful case studies you'll see in here. This other guy who has a picture in it, Marty Wolf, gives me the opportunity to say thank you, my friend. This has been incredible. This is probably the first really public acknowledgement, so I won't overdo it and become sloppy about it. But a whole lot of wonderful work. Thank you. And who else we have? And we had some wonderful input from the community. Ariel Elgin had written a paper on one of our earlier drafts, and we messed him up by writing another draft. And he was gracious enough to look at the other draft, and contribute. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So each of us is going to talk about some sections of the code, and the first thing that we have is, why on earth was there a code? One of the things that's happened that you may or may not know of is that in 1992, there was barely an internet. We didn't know what social media was. We sent text messages using a rotary dial, and there you could get 140 characters in 7 minutes. You know, while you're waiting for the dial to come back. The state of technology was something called Microsoft Windows 3.1, and since this is being recording, I won't say anything about that. We had high-speed technology, and people talk about speed and efficiency and so on. But there's a more important difference. What happened from 1992 until now was the way in which computing is involved in our lives changed radically. Okay? In 1992, we printed checks and we fired missiles and did some other calculations for banks and so on. What happens now is we keep your heart going, we keep your insulin pump working, we keep the traffic moving, we make sure the ambulances can move properly. Everything you do is impacted in some way or other by computing. And ACM needed to pull the code up to start to address that kind of technology. Decision-making, social media, all this is obvious. We talk about machine learning. Some of you in the room don't understand my cartoon. That's called a card catalog box. When you used to go to libraries, you had to sort through a piece of paper, and now we're going to have the robot sort through it in its database and so on. Okay, so we wanted to change the code, and we have some basic principles that we took in trying to do the change of code. We wanted to point to moral principles that one should aspire toward. The aspiration notion is a very significant notion. One of the things that happens is these were, we thought initially, behavioral objectives that we could set out that we could all agree on. And very carefully, I'm going to use the word behavioral objectives for a few minutes, because I think we learned that that was a mistake or needed to be modified. Establish some guidance, and one of the things we tried to do, which was a little bit different, professional societies tried to establish their code of ethics. So the Italian Computer Society Code of Ethics, the British Computer Society Code of Ethics, or other codes of ethics. We took a broader approach and said, can we find what is common, what's the intercultural basis of the relationship between those people who work in computing in terms of their values? So we didn't worry about whether someone wore a turban or a burqa or wore a bald head or something like that. That had nothing to do with the values we were looking for. We were looking for the values of a society, of the profession, okay. Now, in the preamble, oh, implement canonical imperatives. Because if you go for a canonical imperative, the ACM used to call their stuff imperatives. Don't do this! Well, if you do it, you're wrong. And computing has gone beyond it. Nobody cares anymore about whether you bend your paper punch cards. Don't bend your paper punch cards. It's silly. It's out of date. Okay? One of the other functions of that is that if you have these imperatives, you will violate them. And most people who believe in codes of ethics violate them. I'm not talking about the president. Okay. This is the conscious. So we're looking for this thing which we labeled for the moment the conscious of the profession. Okay, it needs to one. Okay. Now, if you can't recognize the self-portrait, you just have to look at the pocket protector. And the idea is that when we talk about codes, lots of industries put in codes to show that they are trustworthy. And the way you show you are trustworthy is you show that you can throw someone out. So you have this list of thou shalt nots. So the Ten Commandments only has 8 thou shalt nots and 2 aspirations. Well, I'm glad to say we did better. What we want to do is to promote social skills, to do things positively, and avoid the issues of imperatives. Okay, let's go on with this kind of thing. Okay, so we have this notion of this aspirational code that I've said that we want to identify the positive values. We want to not have these canonical static values and so on. And then we have these other notions of providing a starting point for education and discussion. So this is the way the code came in. And then one of the things you need to do is to make your aspirations reasonable. Canonical statements tend to be less reasonable than others. Okay. See, I figured that. We'll move my hand up the slide. Okay. And one of the first things we did was to grab the reason for doing the code. The reason for doing the code is we now touch everyone. The computing profession touches everybody. And we used to have 1.1 say contribute to society and human well-being, period. And we added one of the most important portions to this clause saying acknowledging that all people are stakeholders in computing. Okay? That professionals must attempt to ensure that the products they do, that they develop, are used in socially responsible ways. Now, when you say the words social and responsible and society, sometimes you get flack. So people who developed this code of ethics were called social justice warriors and received some other forms of praise. I don't want to get distracted on that. Let's go on to the next one. Okay. One of the virtues of writing a code of ethics at this stage is that everybody has written criticisms of what's wrong with codes of ethics. And so codes of ethics, you're told, are never complete. Well, if it's this checklist, do this. Obviously, it's never complete. Someone invents Twitter or a new form of Twitter, and it doesn't apply. We're not doing a checklist. We're doing aspirations. Okay? Someone says, codes of ethics conflict. It says, don't cause harm, don't kill. Well, wait a minute, maybe I have to kill someone to prevent harm. And what do you do when these two things conflict? So what you do is you bring in, I'm going to use the word, the trump card. There's a thing in engineering called the paramountcy clause. Same kind of principle. Let's have this clause that says that the public good is the paramount consideration. And by public good, we have broadly defined it and left examples of it in the guidance in several places. So some people say, well, what about this particular country's public good or this particular society's public good? No, we're talking about the public good and not your narrow focus or your narrow focus. We set this up as one of the significant moral principles, and then we have a section on leadership principles where we also added this kind of thing. And wanted to show how pervasive the public good is going to be. All right. And he's got my notes up there. And it's blank. There are no notes on this page. Ah! Wait. Avoid harm. Don't cause harm. One more time. All right. This is one of those clauses where people say, what? How do you avoid harm? 3 months ago, my wife underwent lung cancer surgery. They cut a section of her lung. And I should tell the surgeon, don't do that because you're going to harm her. Woo! Going to break the rules. One of the things we started to do was in the guidance, introduce nuances and say, there are those surprises you have, unintentional harms, things occur, you have a responsibility to mitigate this. There is another form of harm where, yes, I'm going to amputate your arm so gangrene doesn't creep up and it doesn't kill you. It's going to hurt. I'm going to drill in your tooth. I'm going to drill in your tooth and take care of something. And so what we want to do is make sure that you deal with things that, when you're talking about intentional harm, that you minimize the intentional harm and only what is necessary. Okay, next. The catch here is it's not a list. What we start to realize more and more is that every principle we talked about requires deliberation and not a narrow focused deliberation. That is, we realized that what we needed was to set up an approach where you would consider the whole code. Some people looked at that avoid harm clause and they started saying, well, you're justifying me doing any kind of intentional harm I want. It's okay as long as it's intentional. They looked at that line of the code. We wanted to talk about reasoning. We wanted to talk about aspirations. At the beginning of my rant here, I talked about we thought we were looking for behavioral objectives, but I think that label is probably a little bit wrong. And I think saying aspirations as behavioral objectives is incomplete. We want, for you, those of you who like it, aspirations plus plus. That is, you have to now think about aspiration, avoiding harm, and what you have to do is look at the rest of the code and its whole body to see how you will do things. What we put together, we hope, is a holistic kind of document. And what you have to do is start at 1.1 that says, consider the stakeholders. Who's involved? Then you have technical skills where you start to analyze the situation and what are the possibilities. Then you review some of the possibilities, and then you evaluate. Okay? That's our acronym we're using, this word CARE. But there was a real learning movement that went on from non-canonical to let's do for behavioral objectives, to let's do aspirational, moral things, to let's do, this is a whole package. person who was looking at clause 1.2 that says avoid harm, and when we talked about intentional harm, they were very tense about us justifying war and doing things like that. If we took that statement, we could actually use in with our students or with others something I call a scavenger hunt. Say, here's a statement, read the rest of the code and see if there's anything that you can add as guidance to this that will improve things and so on. With your help, the the update committee learned a lot about what code should be and how to move forward with the codes. And we're going to now go on with Kathryn Flick will come up and talk about some of the other principles and codes about discrimination and intellectual property. Thank you.
the terms sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation, and these were societies anyway, where these things are now much more kind of considered to be important things to include in non-discrimination laws. We also have an anti-harassment clause, which is new in this particular section. And there was a lot of discussion about this. What sort of harassment should we be concerned with? Should it just originally we specifically called out sexual harassment in one of the drafts, but actually by the time we finished the whole thing, we've taken on a bunch of comments from people and we broadened it out to be any kind of harassment. We also included sexual harassment specifically as well as an example. So this is why we have wording that combines these two kind of ideas, like the specificness of the sexual harassment and also the broader conceptions of harassment in this, because it's about also not just stopping people from being horrible to people, but it's about opening up spaces so that people feel safe and so that they feel safe and that they can contribute to particular aspects of society. So we want diversity to flourish. It's interesting given the talk about Richard Davis today, but certainly we want to move to a place where people's differences are respected and that people feel safe to be able to actually contribute to society. And particularly in sexual harassment, we've seen the Me Too campaigns and all the sort of horrible things that have been coming out recently about a lot of historical and institutional sexual harassment, and we really wanted to basically make a very strong statement about that in the code, that it was not an acceptable thing for people in the computing profession. All right. So I've got it as a sort of the diverse. So yeah, actually also this also generally reflects modern workplace law in many countries anyway, which is against bullying and harassment and things like that. So that's important, but it may be that some things happen in spaces that ACM can actually take some action on if it becomes a problem, but it's not within the workplace. So we wanted to make sure that was really clear. One of the ways that you might want to think about the diversity and anti-discrimination clauses is thinking about the biases in emerging algorithms. So you can read in this clause, you can read that basically you should make sure that when you're developing these sorts of systems and these systems use data that predicts, that makes predictions or decisions or anything like that, that there needs to be basically an equality or at least an unbiased approach to this in order to preserve diversity and to not discriminate unfairly against protected characteristics. And that's obviously something that is still at the cutting edge, so it's quite a complicated thing to try to put into practice at the moment. But I think there are a lot of initiatives that are coming out, like Bias Project and a bunch of other initiatives to look at things like transparency and machine learning and the ability to unbias data and algorithms to process those data. All right, finally, the new principle 1.4. Yes, no, this is good actually. This is what I wanted to do. Yeah, good. So that's what I just talked about. Oh yeah, the monitoring bit is actually really important, which I didn't mention. So there's actually an aspect in there that talks about the need to monitor systems that actually, where the output is uncertain, to monitor those systems so that if there is any bias that might be identified in the outputs of those systems, that it then gets dealt with in various ways. Finally, this clause has new. We were very worried. All these codes of ethics are always going to be slightly a product of their time. And the product of our time is that there are actually people that want to create oppressive systems that are in power in the Western world. And we wanted to make sure that that was something that we kind of didn't condone particularly. So there is a clause now that within the guidance of 1.4 that states that computing professionals should take action to avoid creating systems or technologies that disenfranchise or oppress people. And I think that really we wanted to make sure that we captured these unfortunate more accessible to everybody, but actually opens up new markets and can bring actually more profitability over the medium to long term, which is nice because that's 2 birds with 1 stone as far as I'm concerned. So basically, yeah, engaging with diversity and bringing in different perspectives and different stakeholders and also working with them throughout the whole process of developing technology allows companies or innovators to just engage and appeal with broader communities as they may not necessarily have done so before, which is great. So, principle 1.5, which is quite long, so I just switch it, was originally 2 principles. So we merged 2 principles. One was honour property rights, including copyrights and patents, and the other one was give proper credit for intellectual property. And I'm sure if anyone's ever been to any of Kai's talks, you know that he does not know that very much. But it wasn't just Kai. It was many people who came to us at various points throughout the last 20-something years, at least not me, perhaps with Don and others, and complained about this because it was very much a product of its time. It was very, very prescriptive about basically you must abide copyright law. And of course, we've had anti-DRM movements, we've had a lot of pushback, we've got the Creative Commons, there's been a whole bunch of movement in terms of things like how to kind of protect the intellectual property, which I say with lots of quotes around it, of people who create it. So this is really controversial. Actually, Don gave me the homework one night when we were sitting in Chicago this is sort of always thrown in the too hard basket, which is, and he said, go.
With respect for your talent.
So he said, I said, I could probably have a crack at this one. So I basically, what I wanted to do, I think it's next slide. Yeah, what I wanted to do was I wanted to work out what is it that we're actually trying to solve here. Like, what is it that the intellectual property stuff, like, what actually is the core ethical value, the core principle that we're trying to deal with here. And really what I felt it came down to is actually respecting people's choices to deal with their own creative works in the ways they would like, that they basically respect their decisions about their own creative works. So whether they put it into patent, make patents, which I'm not hugely keen on patents or intellectual property, DRM things, but we actually really should be, respecting their choice to do that. Even if but that doesn't stop us from actually trying to argue with them that perhaps they should try to release it into the Creative Commons or other things. So that's kind of how this then became the new clause. And what I also there was a lot of discussion about what about public things that are put into the public domain, basically. So, I mean, what we would normally, like, many people understand this as being the commons. So, and the Creative Commons, for example, is a really good example of the place that people can put work in
So I came into this working on 2.8, well, not 2.8, so I came into this looking at it from a security perspective, so that's my background. And I had learned about the code a long time ago, and this was the 1992 version. And some of the language here is explicit, is exactly what's in there. That 2.8 was sort of the security clause saying don't do bad stuff first. But the language of it talked about things like that destruction of tangible evidence. That was the harm that was identified, that destruction. And it went on to describe that trespassing and unauthorized use is any use that is done so without explicit authorization. And the keyword explicit is carrying a lot of weight there. Something else that comes into play is that this principle, this in paradise at the time, was written with a very good faith assumption about the motives of the individuals and organizations who are defending themselves, and they had virtually unlimited rights to restrict access entirely. The only caveat to that was in the 92 version was as long as you do not violate the discrimination principle. As long as you don't discriminate, do whatever you want to protect your stuff. And then there was also this idea that you must always have appropriate approval before using. And I want to come back to the before using and the explicit authorization. I can go on to the next slide and point out how do you get explicit authorization to access a web page before you access the web page. So Mosaic, which was the first web browser, so for those of you who are old enough to remember, this is the first general purpose web browser available to the public, is younger than the previous version of the code. Mosaic came out in June of 1993, is when it was publicly released. So our assumptions about the use model of accessing other people's systems and software is fundamentally different than the way it was. And this is a picture that's kind of a meme in the security community that kind of gets to the model that was in mind with the old, with the previous version of the code of this principle, which was on the one side you have the good people who are defending themselves, and they are the ones that own the property. And on the other side are those who are trying to get at and trying to get access to this centrally owned and maintained collection of resources. And all you have to do to be on the good side of things is put up a little security mechanism. And according to the language of the 2.8, if you went around it, you are bad. And it was a very binary, this is just completely wrong. And it didn't get to anything about, well, is this actually a sufficient defense mechanism? Maybe you have a reason to go around the gate. But this was a very different model than the way we use things now. Okay. And for those of you who are familiar with pop and drop tables, another thing that is sort of missed in the previous language of the code is that access and authorization was very binary. You either had access or you didn't. There was no distinction of access to do what. So if I go to a public website, I either have access or I don't. Well, I could type in good input, or I could type in some SQL injection. And there wasn't enough language in the 92 version of the code to distinguish between those types of things. You either were authorized or you were not. So going back to some of the things that needed updating with this previous version of the code. So the previous version of the code talked about that construction. Other harms are possible. So we can talk about privacy invasions. We can talk about denial of service. There are a lot of things that don't fit cleanly a binary decision of, you have access to this system. Well, you have access to do what? What is authorized? And it's also important to really distinguish between access and authorization, because a system might be accessible through a web interface. That doesn't necessarily mean you're authorized to get there. That if an organization fails to secure their stuff, that doesn't mean you are given automatic authorization to do whatever you want to it. Okay, so you're attacked. Now what? So how do you deal with that after the fact? There wasn't really some language in there about how to deal with data breaches and other things like that. And also getting into how to distinguish the response for different intent. So in the security community, we oftentimes talk about honest but curious users. And the honest but curious model is that most people are honest. They're not intentionally trying to do harm, but they might every now and then go, oh, what if I just change this letter here? What would happen? And so how do you deal with that type of user versus the person who's really trying to break in and steal your stuff? What about accidental use? So what if I accidentally, and it wasn't an actual accident, but I made a typo, and I typed one of those things that I've actually heard called hacking characters. So where people have talked about using non-alphanumeric characters, and they describe them as hacking characters. But you can have typos that are actual accidents that could lead to total destruction. How do you get to that notion of intent? Kind of going back to a point Kathryn was talking about a little bit ago. What about respecting users? And there are a lot of things that have been done over the past 25 years that have put users sometimes at risk, sometimes just deny them legitimate usage, sometimes just intentionally make things hard. Oh, sure, yeah, you can set your privacy settings if you know all of these different menu options to navigate through. And then, by the way, on the very last one, we'll do this where we'll make the green box be the one that says cancel. So you need to respect users when you are building these security mechanisms. And the last one is bad actors and the public good. How to deal with companies that they try to use DRM or they try to use other things to protect things that are not really about security or protecting their systems. So what happens if the maker of the CD that you're putting in, a music CD, is the one that installs the rootkit on your system? And you try to bring notice to that and they sue you for it. Or what happens if you are doing work on electoral system security and then you get detained by the government that doesn't like what you have to say about flaws in the system? So how do we deal with bad actors and public good? So in the rewrite, one principle became 2. So 2.8, there's a lot of language that is still overlapping between the old and new, for good reason. And some of it is just sort of a slight tweak in some of the language. So there's no when explicitly authorized, it's when authorized, or compelled by the public good. But this principle still can just sort of be summarized as don't attack others. Then don't do bad things intentionally to others, is how this principle should generally be read. And a couple of some of the nuance that comes into play is getting into the fact that just because you can access the system doesn't mean you're authorized to do so. So there is a difference there. There's also an emphasis in limitations on actions, not a binary yes or no, you can access the system. That it can be actions on the system that matter. out to others. 2.9 is, if you are building things, build it securely. So brings in security as a first-class requirement. When you are building things, again, this gets back to the aspirational nature of code. When you are building things, think about the security issues that can arise and build in proactive defenses. Plan for a timely response because things will fail. Things will break. Be prepared for that and know how to respond. When you are building in these protections, make sure you are working to protect legitimate usage. So security mechanisms should be used for security. Period. Security mechanisms should not be used to prevent you from repairing your stuff, or to prevent or to lock you into a different market. Security mechanisms should be about security, and you should protect legitimate usage. Overall, with both of these principles, coming back to this aspirational notion, and going back to this idea of talking about the conscience of the profession. Something that really went into the language of these principles is about the nature of the security community. That the way things are done in this portion of the computing community is that we can distinguish between white hats, black hats. So the white hats are the ones who are working automatically for the good, and they're saying we're trying to find vulnerabilities to fix. And then the black hats are the ones who are really attacking things. And then there's this middle ground. So maybe I buy an electronic voting system, and I'm trying to break into it. I could be doing this for good or bad purposes. So there are a number of tools like Metasploit, which is a penetration testing tool. There was a system called Firesheep, which Firesheep was a way that I could have this web browser extension installed, and if I'm on a public Wi-Fi and you access your Facebook page, well, I can steal your login credentials. And there are a number of things like this that are sort of dual-use technologies that could be used for good or bad. And philosophically, what we want to do with both these principles is to nudge people towards the good. To recognize that we want you to know how to ethically and morally and how to do all this stuff in the service of the public good, because that is what's paramount. So we want to push people in that direction rather than just outright saying anything you're doing in the security community, if you're not explicitly authorized to do that, you're bad, you're done. End of story. We want to recognize that there is a lot more nuance with that. So that's what went into a lot of the thinking of these two principles. Okay? You're up.
So, one of the new principles that was added to the Code of Ethics is Principle 3.7. And this was intended to reflect something that Don had mentioned at the very beginning. And back in the early 1990s, there was still a mentality among a lot of computing professionals that we did computing for computing's sake. And so we were worried about the most efficient algorithms, how we would implement databases in distributed ways and things like that. Nowadays, most computing is done for society's sake. And so Principle 3.7 now reflects that, and it's up here. We should take special care of systems that become integrated into the infrastructure of society. There are a fair number of people who read this as the Facebook clause, but really we intended it for much broader application than that. It certainly applies to things such as operating systems. They are clearly now integrated into the infrastructure of society. Half of us carry an operating system of one flavor in our pocket, and the other half carry the other flavor of operating system. But things like medical devices, Internet of Things, all sorts of those objects we had in mind as we were putting this principle together in the code. And so it's a pretty important principle to capture that whole notion of the public good. The other two principles that I'm here to talk about a little bit sort of go back to the thou shalt not. Principles 4.1 and 4.2 are the principles in the code that have to do with the enforcement of the code of ethics. Now, since this document tends to be, or is an aspirational document, we wanted to make sure that the enforcement part of this reflected this. What we did was we made principle 4.1, we added the word respect, so a computing professional should uphold, promote, and respect the principles of the code. And we changed this from an ACM member. And this is consistent with our desire to make this document reflect the conscience of the profession. And one of the other things is in the guidance for 4.1, we've added language that says, look, this is a group project, and it continues to be a group project. We want to make the code better. That clicked twice. So in principle 4.2, whoops, that should be a 1. 4.2 spelled out the responsibilities of ACM members. And so separately from this document, we have an enforcement policy. And I want to mention just briefly, in addition to making changes to the code of ethics, we changed the enforcement policy. We made some procedural changes. The old enforcement policy in 26 years was never used once because it had procedural barriers in there that made it impossible to actually use, at least practically impossible. You had to get at least 2 people to New York at the same time, physically in the same room. That was a particular barrier. And so now all the procedures can be conducted electronic. The Committee on Professional Ethics is now responsible for bringing the case. So it's no longer a complainant versus an accused. The Committee on Professional Ethics is now the complainant. There is somebody who may be an accuser and reports to us, but then we bring the case. And so what COPE does is essentially says to the ACM, look, we've heard reports and gathered some evidence that this particular individual is not behaving as a computing professional, and here's the case. And then the ACM has the responsibility then for evaluating what COPE has to say and making a decision as to whether the person has violated the code of ethics. This whole process has multiple opportunities for appeal. There are certainly confidentiality assurances within the enforcement policy. But perhaps the biggest change is we changed the language and the intent of the enforcement policy to be that of a remediation policy rather than a punishment policy. So in the old enforcement policy, we had precisely one thing that we could do. If you violated the code of ethics, we could kick you out. Now we can say, well, look, you did this, and we'd like you to do this thing to show that you get that. Oh, yeah, that wasn't the right thing to do. And so we've got now a lot more flexibility to apply or suggest a sanction that is consistent with the violation. And we want the sanction to help better the profession. And so that's an entirely separate document, it's not in the booklet, but if you want, you can go on the web and you can find it. So Ariel, I think you're up next.
And Ariel got paid the same as the rest of us.
Do you want to do this, or do you want me to?
Okay. Thank you. So, it was a couple of years ago, I think 2016, I stumbled upon the ACM Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct when I was at work. I work as an iOS developer. I'm a full-time practitioner, and for some reason I stumbled upon this Code of Ethics, and I started reading it, and I took it home with me, and I thought about it very profoundly, and I conceived it as a pull request. In other words, a request for a code base maintainer to integrate changes to the code base. As a software engineer, I tend to think of stuff as software, for good or bad. And this is the 1992 version of the code. And my reaction was to start writing an essay. Back in the day, it was titled ACM Code of Ethics. ACM Code of Ethics Considered Harmful, which is an echo to Dijkstra's basically the old Dijkstra's paper. And I was a lot of the complaints that Don mentioned earlier on. Then I heard there was an Ethicomp conference, and I thought I would present that paper there in a more like lowering the tone. And then I learned that the code was being updated, the 1992 code was being updated. And I also learned that it was going in a direction that I was happy with, at least, and a lot of the things that I complain about, and that many other people I complain about as well, we're being integrated. Feedback from the community, including mine, was being listened to. And the paper I submitted to the conference was no longer criticizing the code of ethics that was outdated. And Don, Michael, Kathryn, and Marty were graceful enough to still, when we come to Ethicomp, and talk about my view of the development of the code. And from an outsider of the task force, and maybe drawing parallels on my own practice as a software engineer. So, as you know, the code itself was the update was overseen by the Code of PJAIT task force. It involved 4 rounds of drafting. Commenting and reviewing was a transferring process, as Don mentioned. And this took 2 years. Where text was being updated in public, texts were being published, and I thought this looks a lot like software development. What would be the parallels? One easy one is it's open source development in the sense that the text itself is open to the public. People can review it, audit it, submit feedback. And these things were, rather than the continuous open, you can submit a ticket at any point in time in an open
but it was still nonetheless a open source. You got feedback through email and Discord, the discussion platform. And there were even surveys gathering responses from ACM members. You could say that it also, the code update followed version control, just like separate developers do. You had annotated diffs, actually annotated diffs from Microsoft Word track changes, which allows people to easily track and understand changes made to the text, and it kept the community in the loop. Again, just like source control. What was really helpful too was that the task force we even went beyond this and elaborated on the changes made in articles published in the communications. So you could see the development of the code of ethics, the ACM code of ethics, as following what's known in the industry as the agile methodology for software development, in which you gather requirements, you start building the software, you gather more requirements as you're building the software, you keep building the software, you get a beta version of the software out, you get feedback on the beta version, and you keep iterating on it. The idea is not to go for a comprehensive set of requirements, but rather to polish the software as you go along. And I thought that we could say that this corresponds to how the code of ethics is developed. You had various levels of drafting, feedback gathering. There were beta versions of the code submitted for review. But you could also take another view that I mentioned in a post that I know, which is the waterfall methodology, in which the development is a lot more sequential, which requires you gather requirements, then you analyze the requirements, you start designing, and then you build the software, and then you ship it, and that's it. It's the end of your relationship with the customer. Testing happens at the very end. It happens once, and that's it. There are no iterations. There's no process of continuous iteration as there is in Agile. And you could see the development of the ACM code as following more of a waterfall approach. If you ask, well, what role does testing play? How do you test the code of ethics? And the code of ethics is going to be, you can make the case, it's going to be tested now, that it's just been published, and it's going to be let out in the open, and people will now be testing it. So the requirements happen here, and now that it's been drafted, it's going to be tested in the open. You can say that the 2 years drafting period was just an extended report that's got the face. Then, after thinking long and hard about this, I also came to the realization that the software code of ethics is not software. The software code of ethics is a software code of ethics. It does not necessarily have the same objectives, and in the words of the 992 preamble, it's not as simple as that generates ethical decisions. Despite the fact that I myself and many other software engineers like to conceive of things in general as algorithms, but it's not. It deliberately is not. It actually went from the canonical precepts to the more aspirational stance. And so it is not the same thing as software. It's not as deterministic piece of software. It's more innate, something you use to guide yourself to understand ethics and navigate ethical issues. So if it was a piece of software, you could consider it more as an ebook have the fact that it's a team effort. It's not a single person developing a code of ethics. It would be a bad thing if a single person developed a code of ethics. As societies change, as technology changes, we need new features. We get new bug reports. And how do you know if it's good or bad? It's user acceptance testing. People need to adopt it. People need to at least to pass usability tests. Also, it evolves rapidly, and users expect new features to be released regularly. And that was a problem with the old code, and it did not get regularly updated. And I think that was witnessed as a problem, and that is being addressed. And I hope momentum will be carried. There are common risks as well, software projects and code of ethics projects. If you don't update regularly, it's not a good idea to let your code of ethics run for 20 years, just as it's just a very bad idea for any piece of software to go for that long. They say hardware, the software ages like wine, hardware ages like milk. It's similar. You get to pick what code of ethics they resemble more hardware or software. They resemble more software. Also, what's the point of writing software? Where is the value of software? The good value of software is when you see your users using it and it adding value to your user's life. Of course, software will have value because you're on the head of the software engineer, but its ultimate goal is to add value to people's lives. And the architectural decisions on codes of ethics. Should it be a monolithic design, or should it be made of smaller components? Can a single monolithic design code of ethics have the current serve the needs of everybody, or does it need to be split up? So that's a discussion for another time. Thank you.
Okay, this is a presentation of some of our findings. And now, the last slide that you don't see says, any questions?
No. Oh, yeah, this one.
Which one up there? Oh, right. I'm sorry. One of the absolute standards that we kept getting was that a good code of ethics should appear on the back of a business card or a single sheet of paper.
Keith Miller, just saying. Keith Miller, just saying.
Yes. And so one of the things that we have done to prove that it satisfies the major objection is someone volunteered. We've had lots of people making posters of the code of ethics. And we got one of these copies. I forgot the person's name. But anyway, it does appear on a single document. So if you have any questions, just read the fine print. Okay. Now, yes, Mark.
Yeah. One comment. I would consider perhaps what the opening remarks by Don and the closing remarks by Ariel as from a different perspective. Is it the case that the 92 version was a software, and now what you aimed for was a specification? Okay. Before you answer,
no,
I have another question. Probably have a question.
I'll answer your question.
Yes.
This is the specification and the software. We called it a code of ethics and professional conduct. The guidance is some of the explanation of how, when you're sitting doing the code and it says develop a security principle. The explanation and the software analogy says, and make sure people can use this stupid security system that you know, it may be so effective that they can't use it. So yes, I think the answer is it's specification and it's the software, in Ariel's way of talking about it.
Okay. And I have another question concerning the phrase that repeats itself every now and then. It says public good. Mm-hmm. So who is going to decide whether something is done in public good or not?
So this, you're not the first to raise this question. And it goes back to what Don had to say about taking the code holistically. And in the preamble, there is language about the process of doing ethics as being an open and transparent process. And so in a particular situation, we can envision the public good changing. And so part of the analysis process has to include discussion about how you are understanding the public good in that particular scenario and the particular situation that you're concerned about.
There's language in the code that talks about reflective and transparent reasoning. So I did it just because I think it's good. You want to be able to answer, well, in what respects was it good? And then you can do a scavenger hunt and say, well, where did they talk about public good? Well, promoting individual rights to autonomy, minimizing negative consequences of computing, minimizing threats to health, safety, personal security, privacy, and so on. And I won't read the whole thing, but what happens is there are throughout it examples of what we understand that to be. Some people might say, well, the public good is putting tariffs on Chinese goods. Well, that's not what we're talking about as computing professionals, and we can get into an economic debate there. So we're not talking about those narrowly defined individual notions of what the public good is. And I believe the public good ought to be to provide free meals and a wonderful life for those people who are overweight. I'm sorry. Any other questions? Yes.
If I could follow up on that a little bit. So I assume that you would envision that there might be honest disagreement about the nature of the public good then. And I'm just wondering how you envision that fitting. I haven't had a chance to study the new updated version really carefully just yet, but one of the things I loved about the earlier version was the part that Ariel quoted about specifying that the code is not an algorithm that generates the decisions for you. And so I would hope that in the spirit of the thing still, there's this room for people to maneuver with disagreement about the nature of the public good, where there can be, honest, good faith disagreement. So that if you're somebody who has your economics all screwed up in my mind and you think protectionism is somehow in the public good, and there are folks who sincerely believe that, who are subject to various zero-sum fallacies, right? I want to correct those people, but I don't want to declare at the start that they're unethical, right? I don't want to put them on the bounds.
So there are a couple of cases and points that readily come to mind. One of them is Snowden. Snowden was a computing professional. Did he act in the public good? Would the code of ethics condone or condemn his actions? I believe there is no clear answer, clear, definite, deterministic answer that can be obtained from the code of ethics, but that is to be expected.
Right, that's the right answer, right? Is that it should be, in some cases, should be left tough. Yeah. Right? We should by fiat solve all the tough cases.
Can I read you the bit that you like then?
Sure.
All right. The code is not an algorithm for solving ethical problems, rather it serves as a basis for ethical decision making. professional may find that multiple principles should be taken into account and that different principles will have different relevance to the issue. Questions related to these kinds of issues can best be answered by thoughtful consideration of the fundamental ethical principles, understanding that the public good is the paramount consideration.
And now it goes, the case studies that Michael has done, all of them use multiple principles. This thing I spoke about as a scavenger hunt, here you have a principle where it says do this. Well, look at the rest of the code to understand what public good is and so on. We do this reflective stuff.
And you'll also like the next bit, which says, the entire computing profession benefits when the ethical decision-making process is accountable to and transparent to all stakeholders. Open discussions about ethical issues promote this accountability and transparency.
Wonderful. There is truly this learning process in some talks we've been giving after this thing. We've lived through reviewing this code and not 10,000 but 100,000 folks received the survey. And there was actually a transition in the way we were moving, not fully articulated, but it came out in the process of, well, we're going to do some behavioral objectives for this current state of computing where we impact people. Well, we're going to have an aspiration code. These are things we're running in. Marty says to me, you know, we ought to put something in there about analysis skill. Yes, let's be reflective. Then we start to get questions and we realize we have to push people to various pages in this document where one doesn't do it alone. And then the transparency of the process that we were using, its effectiveness, became something we embedded into the code that says, when you give ethical reasoning, the more transparent it is, the more open it is, and so on. When Ariel talked about bug reports come in periodically. I was a software engineer too in another life. Bug reports come in periodically, and I had to chuckle that the very last bug report that came in was probably about a week before we presented it to the ACM Council. And we have a thing in here that says, in general, follow rules. Follow the general practices, unless you see some ethical reason not to do it. And if you see some ethical reason, think it through, understand it, and move accordingly. And then we get to section 4.1, which says, if you violate our code of ethics, we're going to throw you out of the society. And someone said, those two don't look like they should be in the same document, because you want to encourage people to think ethically. That's what we've done all the way till you got to the very end. So we have to line it, I mean, instead of a long essay and long-winded as I'm now being, we simply say, try to follow the code or do what you can do to improve it. And that's the sense. Now, there's a whole cadre out there who says, we don't have a precise rule that says, this is a computer moral calculator that says, well, it tells me I ought to do this.
And to add one thing to that, I think that it's really important to emphasize the word principles. Principles, not policies. Or inheritance. That principles are, to me, more objective and not specific to a particular context. And so when you do bring multiple principles together in any particular context, that in that case you are now adding value judgments that will come into play that will vary from one context to another. And so you need to distinguish between the principles that you can apply and make these types of decisions in a context-specific manner instead of specific policy statements that are just written as they are and enforced as they are.
So,
you've made a very big play on the basis that this new code, which I think is really good, and I think you need to be congratulated on the work
Big
you've done.
play on what?
A big play on the concept of aspiration, which I totally buy into, rather than prescription. Okay, but and I'm struggling now to, as I've listened to what you've been saying, how the violation of an aspiration can then lead to some form of official penalty, because it seems to be a contradiction. You know, I don't see how you can violate an aspiration and then be penalised for it. Pardon?
Violation is the wrong word. Notice he said.
But it's all in
right
here, and you then
part of our learning came in there.
But the last thing that you seem to promote and you were pleased about was that the ACM has also put in place some form of penalty system. Okay. And so this feels a backward step for something which has gone forward so much. I'm really supportive.
Not follow the aspiration. And the aspiration says you ought to ask a question which promotes us to think about the code as you're now doing. If instead you said, well, you're a bunch of crazy idiots and threw a rock at us and went to point out the door, we could say you're not following that aspiration and in fact damaging progress toward that aspiration. Violation is the wrong word, but I can tell you that the policy does things like protects people at conferences when things are going on that don't violate openness principles and things of that sort. The word violation and the word aspiration don't fit well together. And I will agree with you. What we have is, I'll shut up and I heard it. Because I just heard her take an intelligent breath.
Also, I mean, we talk about it as being aspirational, but we also have sort of stronger wording in there that when it comes to the actual reading and interpretation of the code, I mean, our attempts were to make it an aspirational code, but we also recognize there needs to be there needs to be something solid in there, because otherwise people will just be like, well, I mean, I can aspire to be this, I don't know, an astronaut or whatever. I mean, there's a whole, it becomes way too vague, and I mean, certainly I think the second paragraph of the preamble where it says the code is designed to inspire and guide. So it's not just about that aspirational side, but it's also a set of guidance in terms of how to.
But guidance isn't about violation. I mean, this is about
we confess
encouraging others to. It's a really tricky call. I understand it.
And what we ask you now is how some of the language we know with respect, and I'm shutting up for this.
You could also try to change the perspective on the document itself, and rather than see it as a code of ethics, you could also see it as a ethics toolkit. Try to pick the inspirations from it, which you would use to build your ethical argument to support your ethical position. And your opponent will do the same thing. So, so you could use that to argue that you violated the aspirations there. But it's not prescriptive stuff.
But also the violations only occur within the confines of the ACM, right? So the ACM also basically sees this as a set of rules is probably not the right word, but it's certainly a set of conduct that it sees as you need to behave like this in order, you need to abide by this in order to stay a member of the ACM. I mean, so if you violate those things, then that's when the so it's kind of like another level of the code. So there's the aspirational code, which is for all computing professionals, but then there's the core aspect of it, which is for the ACM members, and for the ACM then to use that as a decision-making tool to decide whether or not you should be in their club or not, basically.
That's one of the higher levels, but as Ariel was just saying, he reminded me when he said ethics toolkit, and pick the aspirations which you think are useful. There are some computing professionals who work for a rather large company, some 1,400 of them, who have said what this company is about to do is unethical, and some of those 1,400 have based their statements on positions, guidance that's in the new version of the Code of Ethics. And so in some sense, they have picked out those aspirational elements and say, this isn't what we want to do as ethical computing professionals. But you're right, thank you. There is this violation versus aspiration. I can either just disrespect your saying I should aspire this way, and in my disrespect I can behave in ways that I don't want you in my society, or I don't want you publishing in our journals, or I don't want you being present at our meetings, harming our members. And you can do all of those.
I think this also comes in, that brings up the discussion that we had over many, many drafts about must versus should, right? And, you know, but there were a lot of discussions about where do we use must in terms of things like a computing professional must do this versus where do we use that slightly sort of softer should. And if you have a look through it, there are very specific cases where we use must, and then the rest is basically should. And that reflected this aspirational side of things, but then it also, there are some stronger forms in there anyway.
Other question? Oh, I'm sorry.
For the more holistic interpretation of the code, which is that it is not just the code, that the ACM has a number of policies that are in place in addition to the code itself. So we can talk about, say, the policies on plagiarism and other things like that as well. There are other specific policies that the ACM can use to enforce specific actions. And so when we talk about a violation, that ultimately it could be a violation of a specific policy, and the code ideally should be used to provide the foundation for those policies. And coming back to the aspiration versus enforcement, I think about it as a question of behavior change. So in the field of psychology and things like that, there are a lot of things that are now better understood about how to get people to change their behaviors. And one of the main ideas is that punishments don't really work well for changing behavior. That doesn't mean we can just eliminate the entire legal system and not have jails and not have laws and throw everything out. That there are still places for that, and that's still a necessary component of a well-functioning society. But if you want people to change, you need more aspirational guidance, and that's where the code comes into play.
Okay, one last, I've been told by 3 of the panel members up here already that it's lunchtime. I live off the fat of the land, so I don't worry about that. One more question.
Very briefly. Can you just mention to me who are the members of NECM in various countries? How you define computer professionals today?
Okay.
For me, it's not clear really.
All right. Here's what the ACM has about 100,000 members in 119. This is the advertising company. In 119 countries, they have sectional organizations, so there's ACM China, ACM Europe, ACM India. This code of ethics went out, one, to every ACM member. They all got to vote and comment on every principle at least 4 times. It went out on the web to major corporations. We have people on the task force from Google and Intel and Microsoft. We had people on the task force from the Finnish Information Processing Societies, from Gesellschaft für Informatik, British Computer Society, and we went as, in developing this, we went as universal as we could communicate. And you may say to me, we missed you, and if we did, I'm sorry. Okay, there's the membership of the ACM. Now, here is a policy we took. If we were lucky enough to come close to identifying something that now we use the phrase conscience of the profession rather than the phrase list of moral rules, okay, where people would be happy if they did it. If we identify the conscience of the computing profession, here's the ACM who consider themselves members of the computing profession. And if we got this right, they should be happy with it because it fits what went on. And one of the numbers we did not give you, we did this survey of all members of the ACM, and every principal came up with almost a 95 or 96% approval rating. The one principle that came up with nearly a 91% approval rating was the very first principle, because people answered that question and it said contribute to society and human well-being. And then they would object because that's all they were reading, and they would say, well, you didn't say anything about privacy. You didn't say anything about honesty. You didn't say anything about this, which was in the next pages. Scroll down and see it. And then when we got done, about 96% average approval rating of the code from the membership. So that's how the survey went. But I think we may have been lucky and gotten more than that. I think we got a good sense from the community of computing professionals about where they would like to be. And Ethicomp and Ethicomp members, well, you know, we've been knocking on your head for 3 years saying, contribute, give us some information, and so on. And so, thank you to you folks. Appreciate it. Lunch. Let's eat.